For being the world's first and most recognizable superhero of all time, Superman as of late hasn't been getting the love and attention he deserves. Really, the only form of non-comic media we've seen him in as of recent has been in animated movies, cameos for other animated movies and shows, the Snyder Cut, and that post-credit scene in Black Adam that's utterly pointless now. While we are finally getting a new film written and directed by James Gunn, that isn't coming out for another couple of years, and with the writers and actors strike going on at the moment, it's probably going to be even longer till we see Supes on the silver screen. However, in the meantime, we actually got a brand new animated Superman series coming straight from Adult Swim. Being announced back in 2021, there was a lot of controversy surrounding the new character designs and the style of the show. While I wouldn't judge the show until it came out entirely, my hopes for it weren't extremely high, especially with the current state of DC at the moment. But at the same time, it's the first new animated Superman show since the one in the 90s, so I really couldn't be that cynical, and my excitement pretty much took over. I wanted to see what a new adaptation could bring to the table, especially one after the massive identity changes Superman and DC as a whole had been going through for about the last 15 to 20 years.
I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
Now that brings us to my adventures with Superman, which, I can gladly say, is a great new interpretation of the Man of Steel. Although it looks quite different from most other versions of Superman media, I can easily say that it is one of the most faithful to the character. It really feels as though the people who worked on this understood Superman as a good-natured superhero, and not a Jesus allegory. Starting off, the animation this time around is taking a bit of an anime approach, which I really enjoyed. It helped the show stand out from the previous animated versions of Supes, with well-done character designs, action scenes, and so on. I really liked the new looks for the characters here. They're distinct and still keep that feel the original designs had. Plus, the cartoony facial expressions they pull off at certain points really helps give them more of a uniqueness. The backgrounds as well stood out to me from time to time. I really enjoyed how they had this nice watercolor design, helping warm up the environment a little. But it's really odd though how there's like this weird stylistic choice where the backgrounds aren't always 100% colored in, which just looks really weird. Like it's as if the animators just forgot to finish designing certain scenes and just accidentally left it in. I know that may be a stylistic decision, but honestly, it just looks lazy to me. But what isn't lazy though is how well the characters here are, well, characterized. I personally think every one of the characters here were done extremely well. Lois was sweet and spunky, Jimmy was kind, funny, and having him be a bit of a conspiracy theorist was a neat angle to have his character go into. They're great and I love the interactions they had with everyone around them. But then there's Clark, who I believe was done so much damn justice. It's been a while since I've seen a good faithful interpretation of Clark/Superman, and I didn't think that this one would be so likable. The show does a terrific job at showing that Clark is a good person through and through. He's kind of a nervous wreck most of the time, and is doing his best at just trying to seem like a normal dude. But once all the superhero shenanigans start happening, he doesn't hesitate trying to help people. Clark is shown to be a human first and foremost, and just wants to save as many lives as possible. Like, I'm not joking when I say I got more excitement from when he said something remotely Superman-esque than anything else here.
Come with us. You are different. Strange. Like us. In this world, it's not so forgiving of that.
I have to stay. I have to believe this world can be a place where everyone's accepted, and I need to help it get there.
And I just loved how the trio interacted with one another. You could really feel the friendship they all had with one another, especially with the show revealing Clark's secret identity to Lois and Jimmy, which I personally think was a really good choice, since it helps them bond much better without there being some weird tension going on. Though I will mention it was a bit ridiculous for Lois to be pissed at Clark for not telling her he's Superman. Like, he has pretty damn good reasons as to why he wouldn't tell her, but I mean, this isn't as bad as it was with Amber in Invincible at least. least, and is quickly addressed in the next episode and resolved without feeling too awkward. I also thought how they handled Superman's backstory was done well here. We barely see Krypton blowing up and Clark being sent to Earth. The show just starts with him as a kid getting his powers for the first time, and that's pretty much it. Instead of just showing us the exact same thing we've seen for practically every Superman incarnation, this show instead uses that as sort of a mystery element. We as the audience still have no clue what the hell happened to Krypton or who Clark's parents are. Like, his hologram dad doesn't even speak English to help us understand, which actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Simple changes like that help make this show both interesting for being a new version of Superman, but faithful to the source material where it's not too different. However, just because I've been singing the praises of the show thus far, there is one specific aspect of it that I'm not 100% on board with, and that would be the villains. The villains are where my biggest issues lie, specifically in terms of their designs and story relevance. Now, the General is a fine enough main antagonist, and he was utilized in the story pretty well, so these criticisms aren't aimed towards him, they're aimed towards the superpowered bad guys. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on these versions of Superman's rogues gallery, since I went into this show with the same mindset I watched The Batman or the animated series, where some characters may wildly differ in design from their comic book counterparts, but that gives those shows their own identity without reusing the same look over and over again, and still staying true to what they're supposed to be. And in some cases, a show's new version of a character is received so well that they become the new definitive version of that character going forward. However, that really isn't the case here, since instead of being unique and different from one another, the villains are extremely similar. Because in this show, pretty much all of the villains now get their powers and abilities from advanced military tech. None of them get their powers any other way, and it's really disappointing. Because essentially, each of them are now just regular people who just got their hands on fancy toys. So that to some extent makes the fights they have with Superman feel a little less impactful, because he's just fighting a bunch of goobers who don't know what they're doing. None of them feel like super villains. I mean, I kind of understand from a story perspective why this was done, since the tech is all Kryptonian based, so it makes sense why they'd hurt Superman, but he's been hurt by these same villains before in other iterations, so making all of them tech based here removes any uniqueness they had. So in turn, the techification of the villains make them become less interesting, distinct, and more formulaic and samey. Though luckily in some cases like Livewire, her suit permanently gave her superpowers, so hopefully something like that will happen to the others to help make them more interesting and distinct going forward. But there's at least two villains I do want to mention that I do think are pretty good here, that are different and still retain what makes them interesting to begin with. Parasite and Mxyzptlk. Parasite, although being tech-based like the others, is at least unique in the way that he designed his own armor, which heavily affects him, plus he actually has more of a grudge against Superman than all the others. Then there's Mxyzptlk, who, while only being present for one episode, was a highlight of the show for me. Although his design is, let's face it, nothing like his original in any way besides being short, his personality and demeanor is exactly what you expect, making him a ton of fun to watch.
Superman, I'm Mr. Mxyzptlk, an interdimensional peacekeeper, and I need your help.
And now, my only other major complaint with the show as a whole has to do with the ending. You see, the show starts to wrap up a lot of its plot lines by the two-part episode Zero Day. Supes faces off against the General and Task Force X, while finally beating Parasite and everyone loves him, and then he goes to make out with Lois Lane, and everything seems to be wrapping up fairly nicely. But then the show continues with one more episode. The last episode of the season was still good, and actually addressed a lot of other plot points that weren't before. But the issue with it is that it kind of throws off the momentum that had been building up before in the show. And this is also where Kryptonite is introduced, and while I am grateful that it wasn't overused throughout this first season, it did feel a little awkward to just shove it in at the very end. And I think that's it. The ending just feels awkward. Like it has everything it needs to be really cool and fit perfectly within the season, but it's all just put together in a weird way that throws off the momentum of the show. At the very least, there's a bit of setup for what may come in Season 2, and it's looking to be pretty interesting. So we'll see what happens then, and hopefully it'll be handled better than it was here. But to wrap up this whole review, My Adventures with Superman is a wonderfully charming and fun new version of the Man of Steel. While it does slip up from time to time, whether it be from somewhat unfinished looking animation at points, the fairly uninspired new versions of classic villains, or the awkward handling of its finale, or finales, it exceeds with flying colors because of how it treats Superman as a character and helps expand his close friends. And this version of Clark Kent / Superman is easily one of the best versions of the character I've seen. He's kind, compassionate, and above all else, just wants to help people because he's a good-natured person. I'm really surprised that not many people have been talking about this show, honestly. I really do think it deserves recognition, and it's sad to see that it's not getting that. However, there seems to be a Season 2 planned in the future, so it is nice to know that the show isn't getting axed immediately. For now, at least. But without anything else to say, I give My Adventures with Superman a very positive 7 out of 10.